Jack leaned back in his seat as he navigated the empty streets of the city, the soft glow of the dashboard illuminating his tired features. At 28, Jack was a seasoned Uber driver. His tousled dark brown hair and piercing green eyes, stark contrast to the monotony of the night. Despite the wariness etched into his expression, there was a sense of quiet determination in the way he carried himself. Driving for Uber had become more than just a job for Jack. It was a means of escape, a way to lose himself in the rhythm of the road and forget about the troubles that plagued him. But just as he was beginning to resign himself to another uneventful shift, a new request popped up on his Uber app, breaking the monotony of the night. With a sense of anticipation, Jack accepted the request and made his way to the pickup location. As he pulled up to the curb, a woman emerged from the shadows and climbed into the back seat without a word. Jack glanced at his app to see the destination, and his brow furrowed in confusion. The address was clear across town, in a neighborhood he had never ventured into before. Jack hesitated for a moment, considering canceling the ride, but the woman's cold stare in the rearview mirror made him think twice. With a resigned sigh, he pulled away from the curb and began the long drive across the city. As they made their way through the empty streets, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over him. Halfway to their destination, he glanced at his app again, only to see that the destination had changed. They were now heading in the opposite direction, towards a part of town Jack had never been to before. "Did you change the destination?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman in the back seat gave a dismissive wave of her hand. "It's all in the app," she said, her tone curt and unfriendly. "Just keep driving." Jack swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading towards something dangerous. Jack let out a sigh of relief as they rolled up to their final destination, and he let the passenger know. The woman, who had been quiet the whole ride, dug into her purse and handed him the fare. Jack counted the bills, and his eyes widened when he spotted an extra Benjamin in the stack. "You've gone overboard, ma'am," Jack remarked, arching an eyebrow as he held up the extra bill. The woman shot him a steely glance. "Consider it hazard pay for the wait," she replied, her voice as cold as ice. Jack hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. He had been hoping for a quick in and out, but the lure of extra cash was too strong to resist. With a shrug, he pocketed the bills and flashed a forced grin. "Sure thing, I'll hang tight," he said, his voice tinged with apprehension. As the woman disappeared into the shadows, Jack settled back into his seat, the minutes stretching into an eternity. The deserted street felt like a ghost town, the silence broken only by the occasional passing car. Jack checked his watch repeatedly, his nerves fraying with each passing second. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was this woman leading him into a trap? And if so, what awaited him when she returned? As the hours dragged on, Jack's mind raced with questions, but there were no answers to be found. And as the darkness enveloped him, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a grave mistake in agreeing to wait. An hour of tense waiting in the dimly lit house where the woman had vanished weighed heavily on Jack's nerves. Initially, the noises echoing from within seemed like a typical argument: dishes clattering, furniture creaking, voices rising in anger. However, as time dragged on, the cacophony took on a more ominous tone, punctuated by a desperate cry for help. Jack's heart raced. He hadn't bargained for this when he accepted the fare. Instinct told him something was seriously wrong, and he needed to act fast. Stepping out of his car, Jack closed the door quietly, his senses on high alert. The streetlights cast eerie shadows, and the neighborhood felt deserted, adding to the tension. Approaching the house, the cries grew louder, more desperate. Through a gap in the curtains, Jack caught sight of a shadowy figure moving frantically. Without hesitation, he sprinted to the door, giving it a forceful kick that sent it crashing open. What greeted him on the other side sent a shiver down his spine. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Furniture lay overturned, shards of broken glass littered the floor, and the air was thick with tension. In the center of the room stood the woman, her face contorted in fear as a burly man loomed over her, his fists clenched in anger. "Hey, what the hell's going on here?" Jack demanded, his voice ringing out with authority. The man turned toward Jack, his eyes narrowing in hostility. "Mind your own damn business," he growled, taking a step forward. Jack stood his ground, his pulse pounding in his ears. He may have been out of his depth, but he wasn't about to back down. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Or I'll have to call the cops." For a moment, the man seemed to consider his options, his gaze flicking between Jack and the woman. Then, with a muttered curse, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Jack and the woman alone in the wreckage. Jack let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling with adrenaline. "Are you okay?" he asked, moving closer to the woman. She nodded, her eyes wide with shock. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ringing in Jack's ears. Jack gave her a reassuring smile, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? What had she gotten herself into? And, most importantly, how had he ended up in the middle of it all? But as he looked into the woman's eyes, he realized that some questions were better left unanswered, for now, at least. An hour of tense waiting in the dimly lit house where the woman had vanished weighed heavily on Jack's nerves. Initially, the noises echoing from within seemed like a typical argument, dishes clattering, furniture creaking, voices rising in anger. However, as time dragged on, the cacophony took on a more ominous tone, punctuated by a desperate cry for help. Jack's heart raced. He hadn't bargained for this when he accepted the fare. Instinct told him something was seriously wrong, and he needed to act fast. Stepping out of his car, Jack closed the door quietly, his senses on high alert. The streetlights cast eerie shadows, and the neighborhood felt deserted, adding to the tension. Approaching the house, Jack noticed movement through the curtains of a ground floor window. With cautious steps, he made his way to the window and peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the dimly lit room, a group of hooded figures stood in a circle, their voices chanting in unison. At the center of the circle lay a bound and gagged young woman, her eyes wide with terror. Jack's stomach churned as he realized she wasn't the same woman he had driven here earlier. As he watched in horror, one of the figures stepped forward, a gleaming knife in hand. With a sinking feeling, Jack realized he was witnessing some kind of sacrificial ritual. Panic surged through him. He had to do something, but what could he do against a group of fanatics? His mind raced with fear and indecision, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just stand by and watch as an innocent woman was sacrificed to whatever twisted beliefs these people held. With trembling hands, Jack reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling as he dialed 911. He didn't know if help would arrive in time, but he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. As he spoke to the operator, Jack prayed that help would come before it was too late. As Jack sprinted towards his car, he continued his conversation with the 911 operator. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he desperately tried to flee the nightmare unfolding around him. But as he reached his car and attempted to start the engine, it sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in the darkness. "No, no, no," Jack muttered, frantically trying to restart the engine. However, his efforts were in vain as the car remained silent, and he felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. In that moment, the connection with the 911 operator abruptly disconnected, leaving Jack in a state of shock and confusion. His mind was foggy, his thoughts jumbled as panic threatened to overwhelm him. He tried once more to start the car, oblivious to the fact that the woman he had brought here earlier had slipped back into the passenger seat beside him. In a commanding tone, the woman said, "Let's go back." Jack shook his head, his voice trembling as he replied, "The car won't start." The woman smirked, an unsettling glint in her eye, and urged Jack to try again. Reluctantly, Jack obeyed, turning the key in the ignition once more. To his astonishment, the engine roared to life, breaking the eerie silence of the night. The road stretched out before Jack like a blur, the landscape passing by in a haze. He felt disoriented, unsure of where he was headed or how long the journey would last. Throughout the entire drive, the woman beside him remained silent, her intentions shrouded in mystery. As they finally arrived back at the location where Jack had picked her up initially, the woman wordlessly handed him the fare for the return trip. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Jack sensed an unspoken warning in her gaze. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And remember, not a word to anyone about where you took me." Jack nodded, his mind reeling with questions as he watched the woman disappear into the darkness. After the woman disappeared into the night, Jack decided it was best to head home, his spirits weighed down by the events of the evening. He punched in his address on the navigator, indicating a journey of about 40 minutes ahead. As he drove, Jack's mind swirled with confusion and unease. What had he stumbled into? And why did he feel like he was being pulled deeper into a web of secrets and deceit? Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over him, forcing him to pull over to the side of the road. Everything went black. When Jack finally regained consciousness, it was late afternoon of the following day. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the horizon as it shone directly into his eyes. He reached for his ringing phone and answered it groggily. It was 911 calling, asking for details about his nighttime call. They informed him that a body had been found in the house he had indicated last night. Jack's memory was hazy, but he vaguely recalled the events. He mentioned that he might have saved the trip and contact details of the woman he had driven. The 911 operator requested the starting point and destination of the trip, but when Jack checked his app, he realized that there was no record of the trip in his history. Confusion and fear gnawed at Jack as he hung up the phone, his mind racing with unanswered questions. What had truly happened that night? And why was there no record of the trip on his phone? With each passing day, Jack tried to push the events of that fateful night to the back of his mind, convincing himself it was all just a bad dream. However, his attempts at forgetfulness were shattered when, a week later, he was summoned for questioning by the police. Jack found himself in a cold, emotionless interrogation room, the weight of suspicion heavy upon him. It seemed that besides Jack, no one else had been found near the house where the body was discovered. And to make matters worse, there was no record of the trip in the taxi app. Under intense scrutiny, Jack struggled to recall the details of the night. He couldn't pinpoint the exact address where he had picked up the mysterious woman, his memory clouded by confusion and fear. As the interrogation dragged on, Jack felt the walls closing in around him, the accusations of murder hanging over him like a dark cloud. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the prison where Jack awaited trial. With trembling hands, he tore open the envelope and read the chilling words, "I warned you that no one should know about this trip. You disobeyed, and now you're to blame." The realization hit Jack like a ton of bricks. He had been set up, manipulated into a deadly game with consequences beyond his comprehension. And now, as he faced the prospect of a trial and a lifetime behind bars, Jack knew that he was alone in his fight for justice.